So what we have done is we have created this beans and we are using auto add also. We also specified primary here. If you want to compare this with the spring boot, we don't have we are certain XML. In XML, what we have done is we have created this beans and we have using auto AutoWire also. We also specified primary here. If you want to compare this with the Spring Boot, we don't have XML, but if you look at the classes, we got dev class. On top of that, we are using add component. So instead of using a bean tag, we are using add component. Then we are using add AutoWire for the auto wiring. We are using add qualifier. We can also use primary. I think when we go for the desktop or laptop, we can also use primary. I think when we go for the desktop or laptop, add AutoWire for the auto wiring, add component. Then we are using add AutoWire for the auto wiring. We are using add qualifier. We can also use primary. I think when we go for the desktop or laptop, okay, we have not mentioned, but you can do that. So you can mention primary here. So we can mention primary here, and that is similar to what we have done here. Okay, and so basically what we are doing is we are using different annotations. How do we start the container? So if you go back to your main application file or main file, using this line we are starting the container. In case of Spring, the normal Spring project, we have to use this new class path XML configuration, and this will start the container. So both are doing the same thing, but in Spring Boot we are doing less configuration. But the magic is whatever you are doing in Spring Boot, behind the scene it is using the Spring framework. Okay, so yeah, ultimately we are using Spring framework even if you are using Spring Boot. So those are the changes. Okay, main application. What we are doing is we are using to what we have done here. Okay, primary here not mentioned. I think when we go for the desktop or laptop, okay, we have not mentioned, but you can do that. So you can mention primary here. So we can mention primary here. And that is similar to what we have done here. Okay, and so basically what we are doing is we are using different annotations. How do we start the container? So if you go back to your main application file or main file, Using this line, we are starting the container. In case of Spring, the normal Spring project, we have to use this new class path XML configuration, and this will start the container. So both are doing the same thing, but in Spring Boot we are doing less configuration. But the magic is, whatever you are doing in Spring Boot, behind the scene it is using the Spring framework. Okay, so yeah, ultimately we are using Spring framework even if you are using Spring Boot. So those are the changes in these two projects. And as I mentioned before, we'll only focus on the Spring Boot from now. Before we go ahead, I want to talk about more things. See, ultimately we are going to build a project, right? And we have discussed this in the first few videos. So we are going to build a project, and the project which we are going to build is a web project, right? So whatever we have done till now, that's basically a console project. And now we want to work on the web project. So whatever annotations we have used or the configuration we have used, that's for standalone project. Now when you talk about web, things are a bit different. How it is different? First of all, when you want to work with a web project, and if you're not using Spring, if you're using normal Java, and if you want to build a web project, so what's so special about web project? Other thing is, the web is hosted on the server, and it will accept the request from the client. So in this case, we do have a client here who will send the request to the server, and server will respond back. And this thing is happening on the internet with the help of HTTP protocol. So we have to use this protocol to achieve this, okay? And this is hosted on the server. So that means the application which we are building should be capable enough to accept the request over the internet, which is your HTTP request, right? So this has to be something special. So you can't simply run this on JVM. JVM is only for the machine. Now if you want this to work on the server, basically we need something called a web server or a web container basically. And what you work with Java, or what you use in Java, is something called servlets, okay? And servlets run in the web container. We also call that container as a servlet container. But which container we have to use, which software we have to use, which tool we have to use. And the name of the tool is Tomcat. So basically we have to use Tomcat to run the servlets. But hold on, we are talking about Spring here, right? We want to use Spring. See, even if you are using Spring framework, ultimately behind the scene, Spring is going to use servlets, okay? And it will run on Tomcat. So if you want to make a web application using Spring, behind the scene it will get converted into servlets, which will run on the Tomcat. So it's important for us to use Tomcat as well. Now the question is, if you want to use a Tomcat here, we have to install Tomcat, we have to run our project. Spring Boot says you don't have to worry about that. In the project itself, in the project folder in your IDE, you will get the embedded Tomcat. So you will be having Tomcat inside your project. So you don't need external Tomcat. Those were the beautiful days where you have to do a lot of configuration for the Tomcat, set the port number, make sure it is running, create a var file of your project, right? And lead project, you will get the Tomcat, you can run it anywhere you want on the machine, not on your car. Okay, come back. So basically we have Tomcat here. Next, we need some layer which will accept the request. So if you remember, In the first few videos, we have talked about different layers we are going to create. We have a controller layer who is responsible to accept the request. Then we have to use service layer and repository layer. Now these are normal classes, but then this controller is a special class because it was going to accept the request from the client and also respond it. And we have to understand how this works. So even before we start with the project, we'll focus on how do we create this controller. And to achieve that, we have to first understand Spring MVC. In fact, Spring Boot MVC. We'll be using Spring Boot here to achieve that. And how it works, let's understand that in the upcoming videos. We'll start with Spring Boot. Now, till this point, we have worked with Spring Boot and Spring Framework, but that was for the standalone application or console-based application. Now, we want to focus on the web. See, the project which we were discussing is actually a web project. And of course, we have seen the project before. But if we talk about the layers, we do have a client here, right? Now, this is a client. And then we have a server with different layers. And then we have a database. Of course, we are using database here so that we can get some data. And we want to store that data for the permanent purpose. So that will store in database and then we can fetch it. We are using a server which will accept the request from the client, which will process the request, maybe getting data from the database. So there are different operations here. The client is someone who is using this application. So you are the client, I'm the client. So whoever opens this application or the website on the browser is a client. Now this client is not just a web application. It can be a mobile application as well. So maybe you can have one more client here, which is your mobile application. And then this mobile application can also send request and get response. Okay, so basically in the mobile application, the layout will be there. What you are going to send from the server is just data. And most of the time, or most of the application which you are building now, follows this approach where basically you only send the data. So think about a mobile application, maybe any application which is your favorite. Example, if you are watching a sport, it can be any sport. And if you don't want to watch the match, but you want to check the score. So we have certain applications which will give you the score. But if you open that application, of course you will get the layout and you will also get data. But let's say internet is not working. So that app will give you the layout, but that app cannot give you the data because data is coming from the server. That means app will already have the layout. What you are going to send from the server, it is just the data. Same goes for your client. See, in the earlier days, if you go back, way back in the time, when you send something from the server has to send two things. First, the layout and also the data, right? So when I say data, it can be simple data, but what about the layout? Layout has to be done with the help of HTML and CSS, okay? And that's what will make your page look beautiful on the client side. So server is responsible to generate both. But nowadays what we are doing is we are using two different applications for the front end and for the back end. So what you do is you use certain things like React or maybe AngularJS. In this, you basically have the layout ready, which will go to the client, and then you will send the request for the data from the server, and then server will send the data. And this data can be represented with the help of JSON or maybe XML. Okay, so that means as a backend, you are responsible to send only the data. The client can be a browser which has React application loaded. Of course, you will have to send that from the server itself, but as a separate thing. Or maybe your front end, or maybe your client is a mobile application where the layout is already there. What you will send here is again JSON. Now there are different formats like JSON, XML. JSON is very famous, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation, which is a very simple and good looking format data which you get on the client side. Okay, so when I say good looking, not exactly it will look good. It's just that it is simple to understand and simple to represent. Okay, so basically this is what we are building, right? Now we are not concerned about React here. Of course, you will get the code in the upcoming videos. We are concerned about building a backend. How do you build a web backend? So we are going to create this controller. This is what is important. Now, how we are going to do this? Now, this has to be a special project, not the project which we are doing, because in this project, we don't have the web feature. How do I know that? See, when you go to the pom.xml file, we are saying that it is a Spring Boot starter project. In the starter project, you will not get web by default. You want web. If you remember, when we went for the Spring projects, the web was a separate part. So we have to add Spring Web here. Of course, you can simply add a dependency that will make your job good. But I don't want to add dependency now. Again, it will be more confusing. So what we'll do is And of course you can do that, it's just that I'm avoiding it. So what you can do is you can go back to your browser. Remember this page, this particular website, which is start.spring.io. This is where you can create a new project for web. So I will create a Maven project, and then the language is Java. The Spring Boot version, so when we have started the videos, it was 3.2.5, now it is 3.2.6, upgraded version. And okay, so I will change the group ID, which is com.telusko. Project is simple web app. And then we are going to create a packaging of jar. And the version which I'm using in this machine is 21. So I will go with that. Next, we have to add dependencies. This is Spring Starter Boot or Spring Boot Starter will be already there. You don't have to add that. What we have to add is web. So we'll be using Spring Web. Enter. Apart from this, I'm also going to add the DevTools. See, what happens is every time you make a change in your code, you have to restart your server. What I want to do is I want to have a live reload, and that's what you get here. So basically you can also, it also improves your application restarts. If you want to restart, it will provide you live reload that will help to speed up. So we just need this too. Of course, we don't want to include database at this point, but if you want to do that, you can add one more dependency for databases. Maybe the MySQL driver if you want to use, or Postgres. I'm going to use Postgres, but if you want to use MySQL, that's your choice. But at this point, we don't need any of the DBMS or databases driver. So I'll simply click on generate. This will generate the project for me, and that's what is here. You just have to unzip it and load in your project. So I'm going to unzip this. So unzipping done.
इसी टाइम पे वैसे करेक्ट होनी चाहिए
कुरकुरे लिया भाई.
And now we have to basically open that in.
कुरकुरे लिया भाई.
शाइनिंग वाला अच्छा
कौन से का
जो मेरा ऊपर है मैं तुम्हारी जा रही थी
वो अलग है.
तो उसका कपड़ा अलग ही किया था, वही सूट की कह रही थी। किसी की तो अम्मा कह रही थी सेम कलर ले आएंगे ऐसे।
अरे कुरकुरा लिया हो, कुरकुरा लिया हो तू।
चाबी ने भी जो है यार। सही है। सही वाली तो है।
In the IDE. So I'll go back to the IDE. I will say open the project. So this is the project which we got. I will just click on open. I will use a new window, or maybe this window I don't want this window anymore. And you can see, okay, we already have demo Spring, we'll close that. So you can see this is your Spring project. And the beauty is, this is a web project, right? And I have not done any coding yet. In the normal world, before Spring Boot, if you want to run your web application, basically you have to run a server. It can be a Tomcat server or some other servers. Basically, first you have to run this server in your machine, and then you can basically run your project after the configuration. But now, I have not done any coding. Still, I will go back to my main. If you can see, we already have a main code here.
डाल दी।
I will just right click here and say run without doing any coding, and it should work, and it worked. If you can see, it says Spring, awesome, this text here, and it says the server started. The server started on port number 8080. So that means even doing any code, it is running. At this point, I will just stop it. I just want to show you something. I will just go back to my browser and I will just go here. Localhost colon 8080. Why 8080 is because we were running the project on 8080. I will say enter. At this point, it says this site cannot be reached. It's because the server is not running. But what I will do is I will just run this now. Let's run the project, and yeah, bit fast, cool. It says it started on 8080. I will just say enter. Can you see that? We got something. Of course, not the running. But what I will do is I will just run this now. Let's run the project, and yeah.
मैं ऑटो में लगाई थी, देखा तुमने? फोटो किसी ने कहा देखो? मैं फोटो
ये
लगाई थी
दिख
ऑटो
नहीं
में।
रहा है अंधी को, चश्मे लगा रखा, चार चार इन्हें कुरकुरे लिया हो एक सामने से अब।
Bit fast, cool. It says it started on 8080. I will just say enter. Can you see that? We got something. Of course, not the output we were expecting, but we got something, right? We are not getting that page which says this site is not reachable. You are getting something. It says 404 because we are sending a request for the home page and we have not handled the request. How do we do that? How do we handle the request? Maybe I just want to say welcome to Telusko. How do I do that here? And for that, basically, we need someone on the server who can accept our request. The request is going to the server, but there's no one on the server side who can say, hey, let me handle it and let me return welcome to Telusko. Let's create that particular person there. Not a person, some service. The way you can do that is you can right click on your project or you can right click on your package and create a new Java class. And you'll be saying, seriously, we have to create a Java class to handle the request? Yes, a simple class can do that. Let me show you. Or maybe I'm just lying here. Let's try. So what I will do is I will say maybe home. I want someone who can handle the home page request. Now question arises, who is that particular person? Can I say person here? Doesn't matter. Who is that particular person who can handle this? And that's where we have talked about the controller. So we need a layer here, a class maybe, who is a controller who can handle your request. So I will say this is my home controller. And in this home controller, I can accept this a class maybe who is a controller who can handle your request. So I will say this is my home controller. And in this home controller, I can accept the request and respond. But the question is, if you want to do that in Java, how do you make something work? So basically we need a method here. So I will create a method and this method returns a string because I want to say welcome to the Telusko, right? So I will say public string, it returns a string and the method name can be, let's say, greet. So someone is coming to the home page, I will say greet and I will simply return welcome to Telusko. That's it. Simple class, simple method. And you just save this and restart and see the magic. So I will just restart this, go back to my page and the magic. Nothing happened. That's the magic. Nothing happened. See, the thing is, Spring is awesome. Spring is magic, but not entire magic. We still have to do some configuration. This, go back to my page. That's it. Simple class, simple method. And you just save this and restart and see the magic. So I will just restart this, go back to my page and the magic. Nothing happened. That's the magic. Nothing happened. See, the thing is, Spring is awesome. Spring is magic, but not entire magic. We still have to do some configuration. Not much. The problem is, see, this is a normal class, right? Now, Spring has no idea that this class is responsible to handle the request for the home page. And we don't want Spring to guess, because once you start expecting your framework to guess something for you, it becomes uncontrollable. You don't know what what's happening behind the scene, or if something is buggy, it will be difficult to debug. And that's why you need control. So what I want to do is I want to say, hey, this is not a normal class Spring framework. This is someone who is a controller. So you just say add controller. Remember in Spring Boot, we have used add component. In the same way, if you want to create a controller, just say add controller. Will this do a job? See, not exactly. See, on the website, you will be having multiple requests. We are requesting homepage. Maybe after some time, you want to have contact us, about us, add to cart, or maybe all those features, right? Everything is a request with different URL. What URL I'm talking about? See here, you get URLs, right? Like we can have about, or maybe you can have contacts. So this is important. At this point, I'm not passing anything, so that's blank. We can only say slash, enter. So I want to do it for the slash. So for every request, you can create a different method which will respond. So at this point, I'm requesting for